Yes.
I think the bottom line of the question that I have is who you understand your audience to be, whether it's policymakers or the American public or whatever. But if I can unpack that just a bit, if you go to Washington and talk to the military establishment people, they're all opposed to nuclear weapons. Everybody, at least in my limited experience, is opposed to nuclear weapons, but they want a balanced, gradual, secure disarmament procedure. What distinctive perspective could you bring to that?
Well, in terms of your first question, I don't write for any particular audience, and you can't really choose your audience. I try to write clearly, but my writing is, has its demands, and I don't usually imagine policymakers reading it. If they do, that's nice, but more possible would be others who might have access to policymakers or contributions to their thought, or advisors might well read what I write. What I try to convey is something of the actuality of nuclear threat and the human experience of being exposed to the first and so far fortunately only use of the weapons. In my case, my study of Hiroshima survivors, the very first bomb that was used on a human population, and to convey what that was like, what that experience was, and also say something about the psychology of the perpetrators, in this case the scientists and policymakers who made the decision to use the weapon. And that was, one has to understand the context of the decision they made and the fear of the Germans making the bomb, but nonetheless they were the source of the bomb. Try to explain all this and convey through that human witness some of the extremity of what we've got ourselves into, and therefore the extremity of the need to extricate ourselves. Often, yes, it has to be an incremental process, no doubt, to reduce and even possibly eliminate nuclear weapons, but often the claim that, we have to go slowly is a kind of indirect way of saying let's not go at all. And then one, in my case, I try to explain the misbegotten mindset of nuclearism, in which, and if you read some of the things people say about the weapons, they're rather astonishing. We can see them as, as a source of keeping the world going by defending ourselves against evil powers, and we can embrace them even as a deity, and because they are so all-powerful, and any self-respecting deity, if it can destroy the world, can also recreate the world. That's a strange psychological turn, but it's not absent in some thought. So by invoking these, both the cost of the weapons, what they do to human beings, and also some of the sources of our nuclearism, which is maybe the gravest spiritual disease we have, the hope is that those who have some say, and the rest of us, can apply pressures, take steps toward recognizing truths that are suppressed, and getting rid of the threat and the weapons themselves. Yes?
I'm just thinking what you had said about your reflections on the Cape and how that had been such a restorative place for you, and then combined sort of like at the same time as such horror, there's these kindnesses that come in these moments of horror as well. Thinking after 9/11 and just, not heroic, but the small kindnesses and what allows those. Like, is it connected to what you found, the spiritual or the nature? How do people, you talked about how that balanced out these horrors.
I'm sorry. Say again what you.
I'm just thinking about the balance that you found on the Cape.
I see.
Power, and also somehow related to that, the kindnesses that also come in the midst of terrible horror, And if somehow those two things, in terms of nature or the spirit, are related.
I guess what you're asking is how I might maintain a balance, assuming that I do, which is
Yes, yes.
between the horrors and destructive behavior I'm immersed in and something more gratifying and life-enhancing. It's on many levels, and it requires that one have love in one's life. I've mentioned my wife, who sadly died about 7.5 years ago, but she was with me through all of these events and very much a life partner, and that was a crucial dimension for me. But also, yes, the Cape has been very important. I call it my spiritual home, and there's something powerful about the contrast between the things I studied and the call it utopian or exquisite environment of the Cape and the ocean. And I think that came to inhabit our Wellfleet meetings on psychology and history, which have been very rewarding and open and thoughtful in connection with many of these subjects. Humor is very crucial to maintaining this balance. I don't trust anybody or anything anybody says unless he or she has a sense of humor in some way. You don't find too many funny things in what I've studied, but humor gives one and a sense of absurdity, a kind of perspective that there's something wild and insane, not necessarily clinically, but morally, about these events, and one sees them as such. And in that way, one is expressing something more humane or more life-enhancing. And then lots of friendships. Friendship is a very precious commodity always, but in this kind of work especially, and particularly in relation to areas like non-Jewish German friends who wanted to confront their history and showed it by helping me or either supporting my work or assisting in it in one way or another. And friendships of that kind in Hiroshima and elsewhere really help in the work in maintaining that balance. So that is a partial answer to your question. Yes?
I found it inconceivable that the psychologists who belong to the APA did not get behind, the resolution against participating in torture. And so I'm wondering what sense you make of them. I thought they had a commitment to doing no harm, and so what is their thinking that could possibly allow them to participate? And is there some piece of socialization in there in terms of peer pressure, for example?
Well, unfortunately, the psychologists don't take a pledge to do no harm. That's only doctors, the Hippocratic Oath. You believe more and more in the Hippocratic Oath when you see these things going on. And for that kind of reason, the American Psychiatric Association, it also had a good leader at the time, has been able to take a more firm stand in opposing all this because it's in our biblical oath, the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm. The American Psychological Association has been slow. They've moved grudgingly, step by step, saying they're against torture, but they haven't really taken a stand against psychologists being present or being part of interrogations. Partly, it's that psychologists, they say, psychologists aren't necessarily, we commit ourselves to healing. I mean, it doesn't mean that lots of people don't fall short in psychiatry, but in psychology, there are 8 different professions within one. And some psychologists are clinicians, and some study various numerical issues. There are many military psychologists who have an influence and who have influenced the APA, the psychological APA, toward a conservative or reluctant position to ban psychologists in relation to torture. But still, there are very hopeful developments among psychologists too. They've been very intense. A significant minority of psychologists, many of them from clinical and therapeutic backgrounds, have taken a strong stand and have pressured their organization quite against its will, and they're still at it. So those are some of the reasons. I don't think psychiatrists are any better than psychologists or vice versa, but the structural situation is a little different for them. Yes?
Do you have a sense that your learning and years of experience have informed the treatment of veterans today? So you said rap groups, and I don't know if that's just sharing amongst themselves.
Well, one can never claim that one's work has some direct, immediate influence on social behavior, but there have been satisfying. We had rap groups in New York City for about 3 years in the early 70s, and we couldn't have reached more than a couple of hundred people. However, we got mail from all over the country with other places wanting to form rap groups like ours, and then finally the veterans then didn't want anything to do with the VA because they saw it as part of the problem, and the VA was very stiff about many issues. But finally, when the VA came around and had more humane programs, they said that they modeled them after our rap groups. So that's an example of how when one struggles to do something in the world, you don't know what effect it'll have, and you can't even tell how much effect it's had. But it's this whole maze of confusion that we call collective consciousness is not fully knowable, but every time one does something like this, you're contributing to it. In that sense, I come to the simple principle that everything counts, though you can't always know the full effect. And the other thing that we did, others more than I, in our work with veterans in general, developed some of the principles of post-traumatic stress disease, and I was on a committee with some others who systematically tried to develop the symptoms of post-traumatic stress that were then used in the diagnostic and statistical manual. And the diagnosis has had its problems, but by and large, I favor its reasonable use because it's a symptom complex that recognizes suffering in adults. Anyhow, those are some thoughts about you. In the back there.
One or two more questions.
All right, in the back, very back.
I have a question.
Speak loud, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you say a word or two about drone attacks and targeted assassinations from sociological and psychological and dehumanization?
Yeah, well, a lot of my work has to do with distancing technology. The technology is such that those who are carrying it out, technology of destruction, have absolutely no sense of what happens at the other end of the weapon. They may see nothing. There was an interesting informal study done by an activist named Fred Branfman during the Vietnam War, in which he interviewed pilots of helicopters, which were attack helicopters, medium-sized bombers and heavy bombers, and those in helicopters had the full symptom full symptom complex of grunts on the ground because they were right in the middle of the conflict. Those who flew medium-range bombers could barely see little forms on the ground and could possibly relate to them with difficulty. And those in the large bombers, from high altitude bombers, had absolutely no contact, did everything by instruments, had absolutely no contact, and it took an act of moral imagination to think about what was happening to victims. And that's the case with drones and with robot weapons increasingly. Yes, they're dangerous, not only to the people victimized by them, but to those who use them and the countries who use them. And they are an example of ever more extreme separation by technology of perpetrator and victim.
Do you think there's adequate discussion in society?
Pardon me?
Do you think there's adequate discussion of this new technology? I mean, it's just being released under Obama.
Yeah, that's right.
Matched ever.
I don't think there's an adequate discussion of it. There should be much more discussion. Most weaponry in the process of use in war is discussed only afterwards. We would do well to have more discussion and more questioning right now. I completely agree with that.
One more?
One more, okay.
Robert,
Oh, Larry, yeah.
we know the difference.
Louder.
Yeah, okay. We know the difference between an autobiography and a memoir. We know the difference between an autobiography
Right.
and a memoir.
Okay.
We also know they overlap.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to go primarily memoir rather than
Well, my sense of the difference between memoir and autobiography is that in autobiography, one is telling one's whole life story. In a memoir, one is telling segments of one's life story. That's what I seem to prefer to do, rather than put the whole thing in one, in one book, in one volume. And I think a memoir encourages one to be more thematic. You learn in this whole genre that there's something useless and pointless about simply demarcating the various things that happen to one over the course of one's life. Even if even if you think your life was pretty interesting, there's something uninteresting about that very method. So it needs a thematic emphasis. It needs a combination of that narrative sequence that I talked about before and focused themes. And I think that doing a memoir lends itself to that. And I wasn't inclined to a tell-all story about all of my deepest conflicts and confusions. I mean, I tell enough about them, but it's in the service of a general intellectual memoir, as opposed to all of the convolutions one can go through with other people and in other ways in one's life. So that is it's a decision, and it seemed right for me in terms of what I was able to do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. The evening will continue with a book signing at this table. The book is available in the front of the next room, and thanks again for your patience as we squeezed in all the chairs. Have a good night.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you. It was so interesting, and I will read the book. I haven't yet, but I found it. I was so glad that David used this as one of your mentors. You're listening.
Line up kind of there. Right there.